We saw a deer standing upright, watching us with human eyes. It was dusk in the deepest part of the forest, the hour when light thins without fully leaving and everything looks unfinished. The canopy above us knitted so tightly that the sky appeared in fragments, pale, uneven strips caught between overlapping branches. We hadn't seen a trail in hours. No blazes on trees, no boot-worn earth. Just undergrowth packed dense enough that every step had to be negotiated, fern and bramble resisting us with quiet persistence. The air was cold in a way that felt deliberate. It slid under our jackets and settled there, not biting, just present. The smell of the woods was heavy and layered. Wet bark, old leaves, iron-rich soil disturbed by our boots. Sound behaved strangely that evening. Our footfalls were dull, swallowed almost immediately, while distant noises, branch creaks, a single knock of wood on wood, traveled too far, arriving without direction. There were 3 of us. We hadn't spoken in a while. The forest had made conversation feel unnecessary, even rude. The deer stood in a small clearing ahead, where the trees briefly loosened their grip on the ground. At first glance, nothing about it registered as wrong. Pale coat, dark legs, the curve of antlers barely catching the last gray light. It was tall, broad-chested, motionless. Then it shifted its weight. It rose fully onto its hind legs, smoothly, without strain. No scrambling, no imbalance. Its spine straightened the way a person's would, shoulders settling back into a posture that didn't belong to an animal built to flee. We stopped at the same time, though no one said anything. The forest seemed to notice. The ambient sounds, the distant creak, the barely there rustle of leaves, fell away, replaced by a silence so complete it felt padded. Even the wind withdrew, leaving the air heavy and unmoving. I became acutely aware of the texture beneath my boots. Damp needles pressed into soft earth, roots crossing like buried ribs. The deer's head tilted slightly, not the sharp, twitchy movement of prey, but a measured angle, as if it were aligning something invisible. Its eyes met ours. They were too forward-facing, too steady. They didn't reflect light the way animal eyes should at dusk. Instead, they absorbed it, dark and intent, set in a gaze that didn't scan or flit or startle. It looked at us the way people look when they're listening. I felt the moment stretch, thin and fragile. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was adrenaline, misinterpretation, a trick of posture and shadow. But the longer we stood there, the more wrongness accumulated, piling up in small, undeniable ways. The deer didn't blink. Around us, the forest shifted. Not dramatically, no snapping branches or crashing movement, but subtly, as if adjusting its weight. Leaves brushed against one another without wind. Somewhere behind us, a footstep sounded. Then another, too soft, too measured. I realized then that the clearing hadn't felt empty before the deer stood up. It had felt occupied, as though the space had been holding its breath. One of us whispered the deer's name without meaning to, the word barely leaving his mouth. The sound traveled farther than it should have, bending strangely as it moved. It reached the trees at the edge of the clearing and came back altered, not an echo but a reshaping. The forest repeated the sound, smoothing it, trying it out. The deer's mouth did not move, but its throat flexed once, subtle as a swallow. The silence after that was wrong. Not absence, but restraint. The eyes never left us. They didn't harden or soften. They assessed. I had the overwhelming impression of being measured against something old and patient. Something that had watched people pass through these woods for a very long time and had finally decided to pay closer attention. A branch snapped somewhere to our left. The sound was close, too close, but when we turned, there was nothing there. The trees in that direction stood slightly closer together than they had a moment before, their trunks overlapping in a way that made distance hard to judge. I noticed then that the underbrush around the clearing had been disturbed, not trampled but parted. Ferns bent aside, low branches pushed back and left that way, as though something taller than a deer had been moving through recently. The paths weren't random. They followed lines, straight ones. The deer lowered its head just a fraction. His gaze never wavered. In that instant, I understood something without knowing how I knew it. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a rehearsal. We took a step back together. The ground behind us resisted, roots rising where they hadn't been before, uneven enough to make retreat clumsy. The forest seemed to encourage hesitation, offering just enough obstacle to slow us down. The deer's chest expanded with a breath that was too deep, too controlled. From somewhere deeper in the trees, a sound answered. It was not a voice, not quite, but it carried the cadence of one. A rise and fall that suggested language without forming words. The sound traveled through the forest the way water finds channels, bending around trunks, sliding through gaps, arriving from multiple directions at once. The deer listened. Its eyes flicked briefly to the side, then back to us. For the first time, something like recognition passed through its expression. Not surprise, familiarity. The forest responded again, leaves whispering softly, repeating fragments of the sound. Trying it on. We didn't run. Running felt like a mistake we'd already made in some other version of this moment. Instead, we backed away slowly, carefully, never turning our backs. Each step felt negotiated, the ground subtly reshaping underfoot. The deer remained upright, watching, its head tracking us with smooth precision. As we crossed the edge of the clearing, the trees leaned inward behind us, closing the space with quiet inevitability. The deer became partially obscured by trunks and shadow, its pale shape breaking into pieces between branches. Just before it vanished from sight, it blinked. The movement was wrong, not the quick reflex of an animal, but the deliberate closing and opening of eyes accustomed to expression. Far behind us, deeper than we could see, something in the forest repeated the sound of our breathing. Slow, measured, learning. We didn't speak until long after night fully claimed the woods. And even then, when one of us finally did, the sound that came back from the trees was almost right. Almost human. Something wearing my brother's face stepped out from behind a tree. At first, my mind refused the sentence. It stalled on the word something, rejected it, tried to replace it with him. My brother's name rose automatically, ready to be spoken, already carrying relief. But the forest swallowed the impulse before it reached my mouth, and in that pause, small, instinctive, I understood that whatever had stepped into view was not my brother, no matter how carefully it had chosen his shape. We were far past any trail. The forest here had no interest in being navigable. Trees stood too close together, their trunks overlapping in ways that flattened distance and made depth unreliable. The light was failing, not dramatically, but with a steady patience that felt intentional. What little of it remained filtered down in narrow seams, catching on wet bark and the sharp edges of leaves before dissolving into shadow. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. It smelled old soil turned too many times, moss layered thick over rotting wood, the faint mineral tang of water moving underground. Every step I took sank slightly, boots pressing into a floor that felt more sponge than earth. Sound behaved oddly. The brush of my sleeve against a branch sounded distant, while my breathing seemed to stay very close, trapped between my ears. The figure stepped fully into view. It had my brother's height, his narrow shoulders, the familiar slope of his neck. Even the jacket was right, the same dull green he always wore on hikes, faded at the cuffs. The face was exact enough to hurt, the scar along the left eyebrow. The way one eye sat just a fraction lower than the other, something you only noticed if you'd known him your whole life. But it stood too still. My brother had never been good at stillness. He shifted, fidgeted, adjusted his weight without thinking. This thing held its posture as if it were being displayed, as if movement were a resource to be spent carefully. The forest responded to its presence. Leaves stilled mid-rustle. A low creak from somewhere deeper among the trees cut off abruptly, like a thought interrupted. The silence that followed was not empty, felt managed. I didn't move. The ground beneath my boots felt suddenly less certain, as if a wrong step might draw attention I didn't want. The thing wearing my brother's face looked at me with eyes that were the correct color and the wrong depth. They didn't reflect the dim light the way they should have. They seemed to drink it in. "Hey," it said, my brother's voice. Or nearly. The pitch was right, the cadence close enough to trigger muscle memory, to make my throat tighten. But the timing was off. The word arrived too cleanly, without the breath and hesitation that usually softened his speech. It sounded practiced. The forest leaned in. Branches overhead shifted, not with wind but with a collective, careful adjustment. Shadows slid across the ground, changing shape as if the trees were angling for a better view. I became aware of space behind me. Not emptiness, but attention. "You took the long way," the thing said. It smiled. My brother smiled crookedly, always had. This smile copied the shape but missed the reason. It didn't reach the eyes. Felt like a demonstration. I thought of all the ways I knew my brother. The way he hummed without realizing it. The scar on his knuckle from a fall we never talked about. The way he always stood a little sideways when he was unsure. None of that was here. Only the surface, worn convincingly thin. I took a step back. The undergrowth resisted, roots lifting just enough to catch my heel. The sound was small, but the forest noticed. A soft echo returned it, bending the noise into something that wasn't quite a footstep anymore. The thing's head tilted. Not in confusion, in adjustment. "Don't do that," it said gently, and my brother's concern was almost perfect. Almost. Behind it, the trees stood closer together than they had a moment ago. Trunks overlapped, erasing gaps I could have sworn were there. The forest had edited itself, tightening the frame. I realized then that the thing hadn't stepped out from behind a tree. The tree had moved aside. The bark along its edge bore fresh scrapes, pale and damp, as if something tall had pressed past it recently. Other trunks nearby showed the same marks, subtle but consistent, forming a rough corridor through the woods. Straight lines. Human lines. Something ancient had been paying attention. "Where did you go?" the thing asked. It took a step toward me, boots landing softly, too softly for the weight they implied. The forest answered the movement with a low, almost imperceptible sound, like approval. I shook my head, more to clear it than in refusal. Cold crept deeper into my chest, settled there. The air felt thicker now, harder to draw in. I could smell sap, sharp and raw, as if trees had been wounded nearby. "You shouldn't be here," I said, and meant both of us. The thing paused. Its eyes flicked briefly to the side, not toward any sound, but toward a space between trees where the darkness pooled more densely. It listened, not with ears, but with attention. From that direction came a sound that made my skin prickle. Not a voice, not quite, but a shape of one. A rise and fall that suggested speech stripped of language. The forest repeated it softly, leaves whispering fragments, testing the rhythm. The thing's smile deepened. "I'm learning," it said, and for the first time, the words didn't sound like my brother at all. The ground behind me shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that when I tried to step back again, my foot found nothing where it expected support. Roots pressed against my calves, guiding rather than blocking. The forest was no longer neutral. It was arranging. The thing took another step forward. Up close, the illusion frayed. The skin along its jaw didn't quite move with the muscle beneath. The eyes focused a fraction too late, as if sight were being translated. "You don't have to be afraid," it said, using my brother's tone with increasing confidence. "You taught me how not to be." That was when I noticed the marks on its hands. Pale lines along the fingers, like the impressions left after gripping bark for too long. Sap glistened faintly at the seams where skin met skin. The forest behind it opened, trees parting with slow deliberation to reveal a darker stretch of woods beyond. No light reached there. No sound escaped. The thing gestured, a movement copied from memory, practiced enough to pass at a distance. "Come on," it said. "I'll show you the way back." The trees around us whispered, rehearsing my brother's name in low, careful tones, learning how it felt in the mouth of the forest. I didn't follow. I don't remember turning, only the sensation of the woods rearranging as I moved, offering resistance where it mattered, passage where it didn't. I walked until my legs burned and the cold became distant, until the forest's attention thinned enough to breathe. Even now, when I think back, what stays with me isn't the face. It's the certainty in its voice. The way it spoke like someone who knew I would be thinking of it every time I heard my brother speak again, and was patient enough to wait for the moment I couldn't tell the difference anymore.